Alright, welcome back guys. So in this video we're going to do another story time. Alright, so I'm going to talk a little bit about an experience I had when I was younger. Around the time I first started learning about the subconscious and studying it in a more serious way. So it's a little bit embarrassing. I wasn't even sure if I should include it in the book, but I just put myself out there, despite how embarrassing it is. But I put myself out there just so people would have a better understanding, of the subconscious. So people want to laugh, poke fun at me, no problem. But if you understand the subconscious, then it's worth it for me. So let me just start by saying that most of my life, right, I've been pretty bad at social anxiety. So I've always had kind of trouble, even when I was a kid, right? I've had trouble with, just speaking in groups and interacting with people. Public speaking was the absolute worst. I haven't had to do it in a while, but I would believe I'm still pretty bad at it, right? In college, I had to give a speech in front of my class, right? And I think that was the first time I had a real panic attack. I didn't really know what those were when I would hear about them. But in college, I had probably the worst one I've ever had in my life, right? And that was when I've had worse after that. I'll actually talk a little bit about that experience later. That was more spiritual in nature. But before that one, the worst one in my life was the public speaking one. So I've had that problem for a large chunk of my life, if not still now, right? So when I got a little bit older, I was like, okay, I need to do something about it. I talk a little bit about that in the intro in the book. But when eventually I learned how to kind of handle it better. So I actually learned that if I focus more on just having fun around people and enjoying myself, then the anxiety tended to go away. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that in chapter 13. But part of the reason, I'll just go ahead and say it, right? Part of the reason for that is because, like I said, when you hold a certain type of attention, your subconscious switches to a particular frequency, and then your belief, your transcendental belief changes. Thoughts that don't lend themselves to that belief, or that logic, or that truth, are harder to keep in your mind. And thoughts that do lend themselves to that truth and that way of thinking are easier to keep in your mind. So when I feel like I'm having fun and I charge that belief, then anxious thoughts just get pushed away, right? So when I just think of having a really good time around others, right, it worked. I didn't know this at the time, right? That was before this theory had all developed and things like that. So I just happened to find that technique to be helpful, and I started doing it, right? That was way before I started studying. Not way before, but it was before I started studying the subconscious the way I am now, and it was definitely before I had this theory set up, this theory developed. So I started doing that for a while. Like I said, it worked for me. And then when I started studying the subconscious, right, and I started creating this theory, like I said before, the first thing that I actually learned how to do was to control emotion, or how to charge my emotions, right? I learned how to charge them and make them really, really, really intense. So one day, I was doing pretty well controlling my anxiety by focusing on having fun. One day, I got the bright idea, right, that I was like, well, if I can charge emotion, right, and I can control my emotions now, why don't I just charge my emotion to feel more confident, to feel a greater sense of strength? Because in my mind, right, and this is probably my insecurity, right, I would think that my not being confident is the reason I have anxiety, which it's not, right? That doesn't really have much of anything to do with how it actually works. We're going to talk about how it actually works, right? But I didn't know that obviously at the time. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to start charging it for that purpose. Now, I also want to say that that's actually a very advanced charge, right? And we're actually going to talk about how to perform a charge like that in chapter 13, right? And that's the most theoretically intense chapter in the book. It took me a long time to do that type of charge. And basically, and it's not really so much that type of charge is important. Actually, it kind of is, because the body impacts it. But we're going to talk about how to charge the subconscious for the purpose of performance, right? So there's emotion, and then there's charging your subconscious to perform things. or different activities, things like that. So I wanted to increase my performance in social settings when it just comes to confidence and connecting with people, things like that, right? Which I didn't even really think of it that way at the time. In my mind at the time, it was just avoiding anxiety, which you can't really charge an intention to avoid something, but I didn't know that at the time. I'll talk more about that in chapter 12. But anyway, so yeah, back then, I got the bright idea to charge my subconscious to feel confidence. And what actually ended up happening was the reverse, right? So I started feeling way more anxiety, right? And that was actually a really bad time in my life, right? Because my anxiety level, it was never really that high, right? I had it before, but it was nothing like what it became when I started doing this, right? It went so intense, right? And I would feel it at work, right? I didn't feel it like when I got home, but it was just when I was at work. It got stronger and stronger and stronger. Every day it was growing more intense, right? And to the point, it felt like I was having panic attacks at work, which is crazy, right? Because I used to have so much fun at work. I used to love going to work, right? But when this was happening, oh my gosh, I hated going to work. I used to, every day I would leave, I'd feel like a breath of fresh air, like, oh my gosh, like I would just feel so relieved, right? But I would always know, like, oh man, I'm gonna have to go back tomorrow. You know what I mean? And this would happen every single day. Every moment I left work, I would know I would like keep counting down these seconds of peace until it would go away. I'd be back at work again the next day, and I'd repeat the process all over again. When I'm at work, I'm just waiting to leave work. I'm like counting every second because I'm in a very anxious state. And it's like, the interesting thing is, like, how could that be possible, right? How could I go from loving work, I used to have a blast at work, because I used to, like I said, I used to focus on having fun. So I would talk to all the girls, right? That was like my favorite thing to do. But I would talk to the guys too, and I'd have a great time, right? I really love that job that I had, right? I'm not there now, but I love being there. So how did I go from that to having all of this intense anxiety? Like, I mean, it was through the roof, right? Well, part of what happened is that I didn't understand at that time, I didn't understand the body's role in charging the subconscious or influencing the subconscious mind. This was actually how I figured it out, right? Was from that experience, right? Because when I was there, right, when I was charging my emotion to try to feel more confidence, I would keep trying to charge it, and then I would just feel this anxiety come on. And what I noticed after a little while of doing this is that for whatever reason, the anxiety, it felt like it charged so fast, right? And I didn't even know that I didn't know that there was charging back then, right? So now it's easy to think in terms of charging. But I didn't even know about subconscious charging back then. I thought everything was done instantaneously. But what I recognized, though, was that this feeling of anxiety, I'd always feel it way faster than any other emotion that I was charging at the time. And I'm like, why is that? I never could figure that out at the time, right? Because eventually, it was always happening, but I hadn't really picked up on it until a little bit later. And I'm like, why is it coming? It's coming in too fast. Because I was used to charging emotions. And I started to get a sense of how long they took to charge. Now, I didn't know they were charging at the time. I just thought I was getting better at sort of instantaneously sort of feeling it, right? But no, it was charging, right? But I would notice that this anxiety emotion it would just come in so quick. And it didn't follow the same, transient nature, transient sort of charging rules of other emotions. I'm like, why does that one keep coming in so fast? And as I kept trying to charge confidence in these environments, it would keep coming in faster than everything else. So it was like it was charging. But again, I didn't know it was charging. And then at that time, I also got the bright idea. I was like, well, what if I make myself now that I can charge emotions, what if I make myself immune to anxiety? So I would kind of lean into it a little bit. It's crazy. Because I had no idea what I was doing back then. But I would lean into it and I would start trying to charge the anxiety, right? I didn't know what emotions charged back then. I thought if I kept doing that, I would get immune to it and I wouldn't feel it anymore. Which that phenomenon, right, is something we're going to talk about in chapter 9 and 10. Is basically when things get old to you, right? So let's say you keep listening to a song that you really like, and then eventually you feel like you don't feel much emotion to it. That's a completely different phenomenon, and there's a reason why that happens, which is very important in controlling your subconscious. But when you're actually charging something, that never happens. You don't get immune to anything. You could charge forever, right, if you know what you're doing. And I didn't know how to charge, right? So I was actually charging the anxiety emotion. Again, I didn't know charging was a thing at the time. So you're never going to get less of it or become or not feel it if you keep charging. You're just going to feel more of it endlessly, which is exactly what happened. And so my anxiety kept growing more and more and more intense every day. And I kept thinking, well, maybe I kept assuming that if I kept doing it, I would reach this moment of like, where, I don't feel it anymore because I'm so used to it. No, I just kept charging it. And so my subconscious would compel me more and more and more and more. And transcendental belief would charge more and more and more and more. And it just kept charging, right? Until I was having panic attacks and I felt terrible and it completely changed my personality, right? And so eventually I left the job, right? But I didn't leave the job for that. I left the job actually for a different reason, but it wasn't because of that. But I did feel peace when I left it. I was like, oh my gosh. But the reason for this story time video is, why did that happen? How is it that trying to feel more confidence ended up resulting in intense amount of anxiety, more than I've pretty much ever felt, right, up to that point in my life? Well, the reason is actually has to do with the way the body impacts your subconscious and how it responds to your subconscious frequency. And it was that experience that actually taught me that. When I kept analyzing what was going on with my anxiety and why it was charging so differently, eventually I came to the conclusion, like, oh, something is actually different about that emotion from all the other emotions that I was charging, or that I was trying to feel at the time. And then I realized, like, well, maybe the body is the one that's doing this, right? That was how I first realized the body is actually involved in subconscious activity. And then I started understanding what the subconscious does from that perspective. And then I eventually bore out to everything we're going to talk about in chapter 4, 5, and 6. So just to give kind of an idea of what happens when you're controlling your subconscious. So for one, not knowing the role the body played in controlling the subconscious is what prevented me from being able to better control it. So that's why it's important to know what the body's doing with your subconscious mind in order to have better control over it. Because that'll let you know kind of what to expect, what you need to work around, and things like that. And today, I actually understand that stuff. So if I want to control my subconscious to do certain things, I always know what type of difficulties my body's going to give me, how it's going to be involved, what it's going to be trying to do, and what I have to work past to try to get it to do what I want, right? Some things your body interferes more than others, so it depends. And we're going to talk about that. But the other thing that's kind of important, another caveat from that experience that I want to give, is just to say that, like, if you don't know what's going on with your subconscious, right, or if you don't know how to control it properly, it could be kind of dangerous, right? So you can end up controlling it in a way that's very negative for you, right? So you got to be careful in how you control your subconscious. Now, I'm pretty much giving you all the rules now in this book, so that's good in a way, so you'll at least have the information. But it's still good to know that, if you don't control your subconscious properly, it can have negative outcomes, right? And I put the disclaimer in the book, like this is right in the beginning of the book, the 2 books, to say that if you could potentially harm your mind, right, or your psychology, or mess up your psychology if you don't control your subconscious, right? So, and people do it all the time anyway, but that's why I'm creating these videos, so you actually know what's going on, and now you can make conscious decisions to better charge your subconscious, control it, to influence you better and have better outcomes, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. In the next chapter, we're gonna go. In the next video, we're gonna go over more about what caused that anxiety and how the body impacts your subconscious, right? So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.